And now for something different. A story of defiance. There are many great Native American leaders in the history of our nation, like Geronimo, Crazy Horse, and Chief Joseph, who each led their tribes to great things. Sitting Bull, like most other Native American leaders, resisted the U.S. government's attempts to secure native land. The American government pushed too far and asked too much of Native tribes in the 19th century. The government's treatment of Sitting Bull and his tribe was unacceptable. Sitting Bull led his tribe to safety, posed as a major spiritual leader, and rebelled against the U.S. as much as possible. He understood that if he let the U.S. government control him and drive him around, that he would have no independence, freedom, or choice. Sitting Bull's actions are a reflection of his resistance to European American rule, a rule that decides who gets the best land, who gets food and shelter, and who lives and dies. Sitting Bull did not want this kind of pseudo-enslavement for his people, where they would live under the U.S. government's laws instead of their own. Sitting Bull was born in 1831 to Jumping Bull and her Holy Door, and was given the Lakota name Hokasise, which translates to Jumping Badger. He was later nicknamed Hakesni, meaning slow, careful, and unhurried. He was born near Grand River, Dakota Territory, into the Hunkpapa division of the Teton Sioux. The Sioux are a group of natives located around the Dakotas and Nebraska. Sitting Bull was a part of the Teton Sioux, also known as Lakota. When Jumping Badger was 14, he was on his first war party with his father. They took horses from the Crow tribe. When they returned, his father gave him an eagle feather, a sturdy horse, and a buffalo hide shield to mark his son's passage into manhood. His father also bestowed upon him his name, Tatanka Iatake, meaning buffalo who sits down. The Dakota War of 1862 started when several bands of eastern Dakota natives killed around 500 to 800 European American settlers and soldiers in southern Minnesota in response to the poor treatment by the U.S. government. The natives would have to try and deal with corrupt government agents that would limit their supply of food for monetary gain. The treaties between the natives and the U.S. were being trampled. The conflict drew the attention of the U.S. Army Brigadier General Alfred Sully as he led an attack on a village believed to be responsible for the killings. When tribal leaders like Sitting Bull, Gall, and Inkpaducah defended them, General Sully attacked the largest group instead of the offending group. The conflict ended with a victory for the U.S. Army, and the Lakotan and Dakotan tribes were forced to relocate. Between 1866 and 1868, a man named Red Cloud, the leader of the Oglala Lakota, involved his tribe by attacking U.S. forces. Red Cloud persistently led attacks on U.S.-held forts in an attempt to secure the Powder River County in Montana, an area between Bighorn Mountain and the Black Hills. Sitting Bull assisted Red Cloud's efforts by attacking Fort Berthold, Fort Stevenson, and Fort Beaufort, as well as many others in Montana. Sitting Bull could relate to Red Cloud as the U.S. government would trample their treaties with the natives again by using Red Cloud's land. The U.S. desired a peaceful resolution to Red Cloud's conflict. Under the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, the government agreed to Red Cloud's demands and abandoned Fort Filkini with Fort C.F. Smith. An important Hunkpapa military leader, along with various other Hunkpapa and Blackfeet, signed the treaty. Sitting Bull, however, did not sign the treaty. He instead told the Jesuit missionary overseeing things, "I wish all to know that I do not propose to sell any part of my land." Sitting Bull continued to fight into the early 1870s. Between 1866 and 1869, Sitting Bull was made the supreme chief of the Sioux Nation. Sitting Bull continuously attacked migrating parties and forts, even after becoming the supreme chief. Sitting Bull's halted progress of the Northern Pacific Railway by attacking the surveyors who were trying to find a route through Hunkpapa and Lakotan lands. The survey team returned with a group of federal troops to protect them, and Sitting Bull drove them away. The survey team returned a third time with even more federal troops, and they were still driven away. The constant delays, along with the Panic of 1873, led to the bankruptcy of many Northern Pacific Railway backers. Sitting Bull naturally despised the idea of destroying his land for profit and progress. Gold was a major issue in both Sitting Bull and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's lives. Lieutenant Colonel Custer, most famously known for fighting at the Battle of Little Bighorn, led a military expedition from Fort Abraham Lincoln to explore the Black Hills for gold and to find a suitable place to construct a fort. Once Lieutenant Colonel Custer announced there was gold in the Black Hills, tensions between the Lakotan and American settlers and miners rose drastically. Sitting Bull did not attack Custer while he was on his early expeditions, but soon the U.S. government began pressuring its citizens into mining and settling the Black Hills, without providing the CU any compensation for using their land. The CU sent a delegation in an attempt to plead with Grant to uphold the Treaty of Laramie. In 1875, President Grant ordered all CU not on a reservation to be moved to one. Those that did not want to move were labeled by the Interior Department as hostiles, which allowed the military to pursue them as such. Sitting Bull adamantly refused to move his village 240 miles through the brutal winter snow. He stood his ground and gathered the assistance from the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux. Over the course of the year, his camp grew and grew up to an estimated 10,000 people. Sitting Bull then performed a sun dance where he predicted he had seen U.S. soldiers falling like grasshoppers. In 1876, the U.S. Army began tracking down any hostile natives that did not yet live on a reservation, sparking the Great Sioux War. Many Native Americans gathered at Sitting Bull's Unity Camp. He would send scouts to recruit warriors from the reservations. On June 17, 1876, Sitting Bull faced off against General George Crook in the Battle of the Rosebud. Crook claimed victory, but had a large number of losses, foreshadowing even greater losses in the future. A few days later, on June 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Custer found the largest camp. Sitting Bull took a more spiritual approach to leading, including prayers, dances, and foretelling prophecies. Crazy Horse physically led natives to surround Lieutenant Colonel Custer and his men at the Battle of Little Bighorn and killed all 262 soldiers, including Lieutenant Colonel Custer himself. While the Indians celebrated the defeat of Lieutenant Colonel Custer with feasts and dance, the U.S. was preparing thousands more soldiers to arrest the CU responsible. Sitting Bull refused to surrender to U.S. troops and crossed the border into the Northwest Territories in Canada. He remained in Canada for 4 years, refusing pardons or any chance to return. While in Canada, he united the Crowfeet and Blackfeet, longtime enemies of the Lakota, many of his tribes suffering from a lack of resources, especially game to hunt, due to American hunters lighting fires, keeping buffalo from migrating any further north. The Canadian government, to avoid conflict, refused to share food with Sitting Bull's tribe. Hunger finally pushed Sitting Bull and his tribe to surrender and return to the U.S. in 1881. Sitting Bull served 2 years as a prisoner of war in South Dakota's Fort Randall in exchange for supplies and amnesty for his people. Once Sitting Bull was released, he was moved to Standing Rock Reservation between North and South Dakota. In 1884, Sitting Bull was allowed to tour parts of Canada and the U.S. thanks to show promoter Alvarin Allen. Allen pleaded with agents James McLaughlin to allow Sitting Bull to tour. On the tour, Sitting Bull met Annie Oakley. He was so impressed by her skill with firearms that he paid to have a picture taken with her, and he symbolically adopted her, giving her the name Little Sure Shot, a name she would use her whole career. In 1885, Sitting Bull's fame grew as he joined Buffalo Bill Cody's Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He earned $50 a week, which is around $1,500 today, for riding around the arena. Once, Sitting Bull stayed with the show for only 4 months. However, in that time, audiences considered him a celebrity. He earned a small fortune by charging for an autograph and a picture. He often gave his money away to beggars and the homeless. Sitting Bull returned to Standing Rock Agency when his time with the Wild West show was over. Sitting Bull would become a big believer of the ghost dance movement, a religious ideal that there would be a native messiah who would usher in a new age when the buffalo returned and the country would be rid of the whites. The dance included shirts the natives believed to be bulletproof. In 1890, James McLaughlin, the U.S. agent at Standing Rock Agency, believed Sitting Bull was planning to flee the reservation with the ghost dancers. McLaughlin made a plan to arrest the chief with the assistance from the Indian police. On December 15, 1890, police surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin, knocked, then entered his cabin and informed him of his arrest. Sitting Bull refused to move. His resistance caused a great deal of noise and woke the camp. Soon the police were surrounded. When Sitting Bull continued to resist, they used force and a fight broke out. One of the Indian police shot Sitting Bull in the chest and another shot him in the head. Sitting Bull believed his life largely in defiance of the U.S. government. Each time they told him to move, he stubbornly planted his feet and proudly told them no. He fought back against Custer when the U.S. Army tried to remove them from their lands. He fought against the U.S. when they attempted to ruin his land with a railroad, and he refused to move his people through the winter cold to the reservation. Despite the U.S. insistence, he gave in when his people were the ones suffering, and suffered in exchange for their well-being. When he was being arrested, his people came to protect him. Sitting Bull is the perfect example for all leaders to follow. Your people will fight and die for you if you are willing to do the same for them.
Thanks, Dalen, for that great piece about Sitting Bull and how the infamous Wounded Knee came to be. My name is Zach Murphy. For my part in this episode, I'll be shifting gears into the history of a cultural phenomenon that is seldom acknowledged and showcases how the American West history still influences today. Geronimo, trademarked. Geronimo was a name I often yelled doing cannonballs at the public pools. I didn't know why or what it meant, or that it was even a name. All I knew is that it was something one yelled, usually doing a cannonball. That is, until I read about the 1904 St. Louis Exposition, the months-long event that featured several marvels, including none other than the Terror of the West himself, Geronimo. This exposition celebrated the centennial of Lewis and Clark's expedition out west and would display many attractions for anyone willing to pay a ticket. This included, but was not limited to, Native American chiefs to represent the conquered tribes of the frontier. Unlike the other chiefs who visited the exposition, including the Nez Perce's Chief Joseph, Geronimo was most noticeably not a chief. He also showed up in chains. This person, who many participants knew just from newspapers and possibly old cigarette trading cards, appeared old and defeated. At this time, Geronimo was in his 70s, wearing simple clothes, nothing like the native garbs expected, and sported deep wrinkles of a hardened life in the Arizona desert. Viewers expected a spectacle, and like seeing a tiger in a zoo, they were initially struck by disappointment or sympathy. But just like at the zoo, it passed, and a new opportunity to score some souvenirs and pictures with the terrifying human tiger hit the market. Geronimo appeared under military supervision due to his status as prisoner of war. Geronimo was an Apache responsible for several raids throughout the West, on both sides of the national border. There were robberies, murders, scalpings, along with any other random act of violence the courts could blame him for. After organizing 3 reservation breakouts and the resulting warpaths during the 1870s and 80s, Geronimo and his band surrendered for the last time in 1888, marking the last of the Indian Wars for the United States and starting Geronimo and the Apaches' long journey of relocation. While his lack of distinguishing Native American clothing was a disappointment for fairgoers, his ability to provide souvenirs was phenomenal. At the fair in his display, Geronimo made simple bows that were assumed high quality. He would sell the buttons off his clothes, which he had plenty of replacements. People even bought his hats, which, like the buttons, were always replaced. This was offered at a reasonable price. And if one felt frugal, entitled, or foolhardy enough to attempt to take a photograph of Geronimo without paying, his friends from the reservation would make sure he would be compensated, even going as far as breaking one fool's camera. This kicked off an eventful end to Geronimo's life, going to events across the United States and making a killing selling souvenirs. This amazing story, though, left me asking one more question. Why did I yell his name doing a cannonball? Well, I saw other kids doing that, so they probably saw other kids doing that, and so on. Memes are nothing new per se, and kids are impressionable. But where did this meme come from? Answer: early American airborne. Cool, but why? Geronimo died in 1909 and became a POW in the 1880s. So in what relation does he have with being yelled jumping out of planes? I knew some Native American culture was appropriated by the airborne, like the Mohawk haircut and war paint, so I started looking into this to see if there's a connection. Well, I got to learn about Sergeant McNeese. While I got to learn that Sergeant McNeese was the bringer of Mohawks and war paint to the 101st Airborne, and that he and his family lived in Oklahoma, and his mom was Choctaw, the Geronimo thing predates his service, and even the 101st. Allegedly, these early airborne soldiers saw the film Geronimo during their training, and one soldier decided he was going to yell Geronimo when he jumped out of the plane. The sourcing for this is spotty, as spotty as one could expect from trying to research an urban colloquialism. And while there is some source corroboration, their primary sourcing is usually spotty or vacant. For decades, Americans fought the Apache, and Geronimo somehow always survived. Countless conflicts occurred in the Arizona desert and mountains, and many generals and officers sought their glory for his death or capture. For decades, Americans fought the Apache, and Geronimo somehow always survived. Countless conflicts occurred in the Arizona desert and mountains, and many generals and officers sought their glory for his death or capture. Coming fresh out of academy, future General Pershing chose to lead a cavalry unit and transferred west for an opportunity at this glory, only coming short by a few weeks of his capture. This ongoing legacy of evasion, capture, and escape was the groundwork for Geronimo's legend, and result in him and his Chiricahua being the antagonists in most westerns, including the film Geronimo. After these events, though, start the sad, cruel reality of the Apache's forced relocation following Geronimo's surrender at Skeleton Canyon. Most of the children were taken to Indian schools across the United States, and the rest of the Apache were relocated to Florida. While in Florida, many Apache died from respiratory illnesses, with numbers up to 25%. After finally achieving acknowledgement that they were not suited or supported enough to live there, they were then moved to Alabama, in part of fears about the ghost dance Staten already mentioned. Another 5 years of similar issues, the Apache were then sent to Oklahoma at the Fort Sill Military Reservation, where they would be homed for the rest of Geronimo's life. In 1904, an academic who was serving as superintendent of the schools in the neighboring town of Lawton built a relationship with him during his time there and asked him to help write an autobiography. After refusal from the fort's commanding officer, saying he would sooner see Geronimo hanged than be a marvel to the public, the scholar wrote to President Teddy Roosevelt asking for permission, and with few caveats, it was granted. The aspiring academic, Colonel S.M. Barrett, found his breakout piece with interpreting and transcribing the translation of Geronimo's autobiography. This would be his first of many books about Native American tribes throughout the U.S. Barrett, however, did not speak Apache, and Geronimo did not speak English. In their first interaction, Barrett helped Geronimo communicate, translating Spanish for a trade, but Geronimo's Spanish, while impressive, was not acknowledged as fluent. To help Geronimo tell his story in his native tongue, Asa Deklugi, who was one of the Apache children taken to the boarding schools after Geronimo's final surrender, interpreted the indigenous language into English, and then Barrett wrote it down, along with making edits needed for readability. This was a common situation when transcribing Native American stories into other languages. In Huzar Hernandez's article, The Real Geronimo Got Away, she dove into this autobiography and described pieces she describes as bi-autobiographies. This means to inform the reader that this is not an autobiography, but a biography written by the interpretations of an autobiography. Geronimo, by this point, is an old man who only wishes to see his people go back to their homelands in Arizona. Asa is Geronimo's nephew and a pessimistic victim of the Indian school system. While Geronimo was commonly a war chief, Asa would become the chief of his tribe. So there is little reason to suspect that either of them had much intention to alter the story due to the intent of his autobiography being a well-constructed argument trying to appeal to President Roosevelt and the American masses for the Apache to return home. S.M. Barrett is the real one to be aware of. What better way to solidify your credentials than writing the autobiography of the most notorious Indian any member of the United States or Mexico knew? This said, Barrett was not a super scummy academic comparatively at this point in his career. Geronimo had a long history of warming up to whites in their original reservation, lulling them into a false state of security before launching his breakouts, showing skill of playing off the non-Indian perceptions of him. While Geronimo was never cold to Barrett, when he learned that Barrett was wounded by a Mexican, Geronimo warmed up to him and was never shy of voicing his intolerance. This was the start of their relationship beyond a guard-prisoner dynamic, and what eventually led to Geronimo trusting Barrett enough to have him help transcribe his autobiography. Barrett did work with anthropologists on the reservation, which developed his interest in Native Americans, and while he does have a very personal stake in getting this book published, he served the source well in trying to get Geronimo's message across. This is because it is obvious Geronimo has a goal greater than simply telling his story once one makes it to the last few paragraphs of his book. Barrett wrote that and submitted it to the president and other government authorities. He supports Geronimo's body by citing news articles to corroborate, while also showing their lack of transparency or blatant bias against the Apache and Geronimo. Barrett also went as far as putting in footnotes that state Geronimo may be exaggerating in some cases, but blatantly acknowledges the injustices whites did against all Native Americans and throws his academic support behind helping Geronimo and the Apache seem justifiably sympathetic. Being a friend of Geronimo and the Apache would serve Barrett well in his future Indian studies. If one takes these factors into play, then Geronimo's autobiography is an interesting look into the Apache, Geronimo's life, and how he set his story up for his goal. I can't lie in saying I wasn't excited to see the myth from his own perspective. But beyond these factors, this is unfortunately never going to happen. Geronimo was an Apache. He led his band on countless raids and massacres and evaded the law on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border for decades. If not viewed favorably by the United States, this autobiography would not be published. If Geronimo had a burning hatred for white Americans, he would not be allowed to express it. One could then see his hatred towards Mexicans as his in to get white Americans on his side. Like most autobiographies written by Native Americans, Geronimo's story starts with the Apache creation story. If one looks past the cultural division, it's a tale close to David and Goliath, except it was Apache and a dragon, and instead of a sling and stones, it was a bow and 4 arrows. Geronimo then follows this chapter with describing the tribal layout in the region, their relationships to each other and his varying relationships with them, including his translator Asa's familial attachment to the area. He even mentioned the civility and acquaintanceship the Apache had with the neighboring Navajo. Then, Geronimo described his personal family relations with extended family leading to his parents. He tells us his childhood activities, how he became a man and all duties leading up there, showing their prowess in many civilized activities like farming and smoking tobacco recreationally. He talked about how he married his childhood sweetheart, going as far as immortalizing his father-in-law in his book as being unwilling to let her go, or not caring of their love, with just how many horses he wanted for her dowry, despite them being lifelong lovers. He left without saying a word and returned 3 days later with them, completing their marriage process. Geronimo's story turns into a tale of tragedy. In 1858, during a time of relative peace, Geronimo and his group were trading in Mexico. While there, a local garrison found their family's camp lightly guarded and launched a massacre. While returning, Geronimo and the other men encountered stragglers from the camp, fleeing towards them saying they had been attacked. Among the dead were Geronimo's entire family, including his elderly mother, wife, and their 3 young children. The chief had them flee back to the tribe to amass a retaliatory effort. Geronimo, having lost the most, was allowed to lead. After burning all his family's possessions, Geronimo was tasked to neighboring tribes to ask for warriors to volunteer, and after hearing his story of loss, he amassed an army. Geronimo led this three-tribe coalition against the garrison in summer of 1859. Only a few braves survived, but they killed the soldiers and possibly razed an entire town. This battle is also where Geronimo gets to be called Geronimo. No one is sure why. While fighting, he used all his arrows and broke his spears and was left with only his knife. He cut down several soldiers this way, evading gunfire from all directions. Due to religious figures or inability to pronounce his real name, Goyakla, Geronimo was all that was heard from the soldiers before being stabbed to death. When it was over and they returned home, the tribe was satisfied and celebrated the spoils of victory. But for Geronimo, all he acquired was his name. This burning sense for revenge is Geronimo's reason for his warpaths into Mexico. It would be a reoccurring event, with varying sizes of bands, and often Geronimo would be the remaining survivor, returning often with less than he left with, which would only bring plenty of resentment. He did not care. He only had a constant burn for revenge for his family. This would go on for years, earning him his initial reputation of being impossible to capture, and would even cite his greatest battle fighting the Mexican army, transitioning into his part on the whites. Geronimo described the first time meeting white people, who were surveyors, and that they were a nice group of people whom they traded with, which was where he saw paper money for the first time. When the Apache met soldiers, though, is when the animosity towards whites begins. The soldiers allegedly honored no treaties and even lied about a peace deal, which led to his chief, Magnus Colorado, being murdered, along with most of his tribe who left with him in a chapter he called the Greatest of Wrongs. Geronimo escaped this massacre because him and a small group stayed behind, for Geronimo did not trust the soldiers. This is a section Barrett helps support by going through military documents and newspapers from neighboring towns to corroborate this great betrayal. This would begin several engagements with the U.S. Army and start Geronimo's infamous series of reservation breakouts, leading up to his surrender in the 1880s. Then he details the incredibly sad aftermath of relocations, forced hard labor, no food, and no upholding of their terms for surrender, which in the chapter beforehand, Barrett shows military telegrams of the surrender, alluding little to terms of surrender, with some even going as far as saying it was unconditional. For years, Geronimo tried reaching General Miles over their terms and received no word. Barrett expressed his own opinion and skepticism in the text over the government honoring the treaty at Skeleton Canyon. While this is often marked as the last of the Indian Wars, it is not the end of Geronimo's book. He continues with a fourth part, The Old and the New, and begins the hard sell to white Americans. This begins with the unwritten laws of the Apache, the organization of legal courts, adoptions, social gatherings, in a sense to show everything Americans enjoyed or considered civilized was a part of Apache culture. Then Geronimo leads into the St. Louis World's Fair and how he returned with more money than he had ever owned. He describes all the marvels and kindness whites showed him at the event, even though it was limited because his handlers often refused many offers for him. Geronimo also showed admiration to the USA from participating in the fairs and seeing the technological marvels they built, wishing all his people could have participated. Geronimo then transitions into religion, how he adopted Christianity like a good Indian, and how it would be so generous of whites to allow the Apache to return to Arizona so they can keep learning from generous whites, and how all would be forgiven if the Apache could just return to Arizona. This story Geronimo, Asa, and Barrett tell is structured as an amazing argument. From the book's dedication to President Roosevelt by Geronimo to the several instances Barrett uses sources to help support Geronimo's argument, from telling the creation story to neighboring cohesion to show civility, he mentions working the farmlands, growing up, informing the reader the perceived nomadic Apache were part-time farmers, something Americans were very intimate with. He connects with young love. He tells his tragedy with Mexico to help establish that the Apache, and especially Geronimo himself, hated Mexicans, a feeling many white Americans shared that they hoped would be sympathized with. Geronimo's take on interactions with white Americans is often not portrayed as too racist like towards Mexicans, but in anger towards the U.S. military and their lack of trustworthiness in upholding their word, a grievance many tribes have historically shared, and Barrett himself even defends within the footnotes on more than one occasion. Unfortunately, Geronimo's plea did not fully work. Geronimo will die in Oklahoma, and soon after, in 1913, the Apache will be relocated again, this time to their current reservation area on the border of New Mexico and Arizona. While certainly closer to their ancestral home, not all the Apache are there, because of intertribal mixing from relocations, the Geronimo's Chiricahua are scattered or assimilated. The reservation setup were not new for the Apache as a whole, but the Chiricahua and others who followed Geronimo. Some other Apache went more quietly into the night, allowing them earlier reservations and land holdings, even being used as the scouts that tracked Geronimo down, connecting into Geronimo's tale of Apache losing their way when they are gone from their homeland for too long. He does not explicitly say this, but alludes to it, showing his skill historian Frederick Jackson Turner even noticed in the 1890s of how Geronimo often had a way of saying things that could be interpreted in a variety of ways. Goyakla died in 1909. Geronimo, as an indigenous POW, lives on. While his image has been shifted to a brave warrior standing against oppression, he is still being used for monetary gains, and not in a holistic wielding from the Apache neither. The Apache, while still not able to occupy their ancestral home, are used as the name for attack helicopters, firing Tomahawk trademarked missiles, even though the Apache were archers, to help spread democracy across the globe. This enduring influence built on so much vagueness and hearsay are ultimately why I think Geronimo is not only important, but a relevant ongoing legacy of the American West. So next time you're at your local pool or swimming hole and hear someone yell Geronimo, you'll have an interesting and depressing story to tell your friends and family. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's stories about a couple very different Indigenous experiences and how they are still relevant today. Till next time, this has been the Not So Final Frontier podcast created by History 425 American West at Lewis Clark State College.